June 20th, 2018, Lancaster, California. The tranquility of this suburban enclave was shattered by a call to emergency services. On the line was Heather Barron, the mother of 10-year-old Anthony Avalos. Her voice, devoid of the panic one might expect, conveyed a troubling narrative. She claimed that Anthony had suffered a fall, rendering him unresponsive. As paramedics arrived at the family's residence, they were met with a scene that starkly contradicted Heather's account. Anthony lay motionless, his body bearing the unmistakable marks of prolonged abuse. Bruises of varying hues painted a grim tapestry across his skin, and signs of severe malnutrition were evident. The paramedics' immediate assessment indicated that this was not the result of a simple household accident. The discrepancy between Heather's calm demeanor during the 911 call and the grievous condition of her son raised immediate suspicions. Why would a mother, witnessing her child in such a dire state, exhibit such a lack of urgency? This incongruity set the stage for a deeper investigation into the events leading up to this tragic moment. A very quick one before we continue. If this story unsettles you, if it makes you question how such horrors unfold, you're not alone. These are the truths people often ignore, but here, we confront them head-on. Subscribe now to uncover more cases and to see previous videos on the channel that demand to be heard. The facts won't change, but awareness can make all the difference. Further examination of the 911 call revealed inconsistencies in Heather's narrative. She mentioned that Anthony had been acting strangely before the alleged fall, suggesting a sudden onset of symptoms. However, the severity and multitude of his injuries told a different story, one of sustained and escalating abuse over time. As first responders worked to stabilize Anthony for transport to the hospital, law enforcement officers began their preliminary inquiries. Neighbors were approached, and some recounted hearing disturbances from the residents in the past, though none had anticipated such a tragic outcome. The community of Lancaster, California, known for its quiet streets and close-knit neighborhoods, was blindsided by the unfolding horror within one of its homes. At the hospital, medical professionals confirmed the paramedics' worst fears. Anthony's injuries were extensive and not consistent with a mere fall. The attending physicians noted signs of blunt force trauma, burns, and evidence of long-term physical abuse. These findings prompted immediate involvement from Child Protective Services and law enforcement agencies. The initial narrative spun by Heather Barron was rapidly unraveling. The facade of a concerned mother crumbled under the weight of mounting evidence pointing toward a much darker reality. The 911 call, intended perhaps to mask the truth, instead became a pivotal piece of evidence, highlighting the stark contrast between Heather's claims and the grim reality of Anthony's condition. In the days that followed, investigators delved deeper into the family's history. They discovered multiple reports of suspected child abuse filed with the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, concerning Anthony and his siblings. Despite these reports, adequate interventions had not been implemented, allowing the cycle of abuse to continue unabated. The community grappled with a profound sense of collective guilt and sorrow. How had such egregious abuse gone unnoticed? What failures within the system had allowed this tragedy to unfold? These questions loomed large as the investigation progressed, casting a shadow over Lancaster and prompting calls for accountability and reform. As the truth emerged, it became evident that the 911 call was not a plea for help but a desperate attempt to conceal a pattern of horrific abuse. Heather Barron's portrayal of a concerned mother was a thin veneer, hiding a reality of cruelty and neglect that ultimately led to the untimely death of her son, Anthony Avalos. The sterile environment of the coroner's office stood in stark contrast to the horrors it sought to unravel. On the examination table lay the lifeless body of Anthony Avalos, a 10-year-old boy whose death had sent shockwaves through the community. The task before the medical examiner was grim: to uncover the truths hidden beneath the bruises and scars that marred the child's body. The autopsy revealed a harrowing narrative of prolonged suffering. Anthony's body bore extensive bruising, burns, and signs of malnutrition. These injuries were not the result of a single incident, but had been inflicted over an extended period. The coroner noted severe blunt force injuries to his brain, indicating repeated trauma. Further examination uncovered additional layers of abuse. There were injuries to Anthony's side, hips, arms, and even his feet. Some wounds were fresh, while others had begun to heal, suggesting a continuous cycle of torment. The presence of burns indicated exposure to heat or caustic substances, adding another dimension to the cruelty he endured. The autopsy also revealed that Anthony was severely malnourished. His body weight was significantly below average for his age, and there was evidence of muscle wasting. This chronic starvation would have left him weak and vulnerable, unable to escape or defend himself from his abusers. The coroner's findings painted a picture of unimaginable suffering. Anthony had been subjected to a relentless barrage of physical abuse, starvation, and neglect. The injuries to his brain were particularly telling, indicating that he had been violently shaken or struck on multiple occasions. This repeated trauma would have caused severe pain, confusion, and ultimately, his death. The autopsy report served as a stark testament to the prolonged and systematic nature of the abuse Anthony endured. It was clear that his death was not the result of a sudden outburst, but rather the culmination of sustained cruelty. The findings underscored the severity of the charges against his mother, Heather Barron, and her boyfriend, Kareem Leva, who were accused of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture. In the aftermath of the autopsy, the community of Lancaster, California, grappled with the horrifying details of Anthony's suffering. The coroner's report not only provided crucial evidence for the legal proceedings, but also highlighted the systemic failures that allowed such prolonged abuse to occur unchecked. In the sterile confines of an interrogation room in Lancaster, California, two individuals sat under the unyielding gaze of law enforcement, Heather Barron and her boyfriend, Kareem Leva. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Detectives, seasoned by years of experience, observed the pair closely, searching for cracks in their facades. Heather Barron, the mother of 10-year-old Anthony Avalos, presented herself with an air of composed detachment. Her demeanor was one of calculated calm, as if rehearsed for this very moment. Across from her, Kareem Leva exuded a different energy, a blend of defensiveness and bravado, a man attempting to mask unease with a veneer of confidence. The initial statements from both were meticulously crafted, each word chosen with care. They spoke of accidents, of misunderstandings, of a tragic mishap that led to Anthony's untimely death. Heather claimed that Anthony had suffered a fall, that he was a clumsy child prone to injuries. Kareem echoed her narrative, adding that they had done everything they could to care for him. Yet, as detectives delved deeper, inconsistencies began to surface. The timeline of events they provided was riddled with contradictions. Heather mentioned that Anthony had been injured in the morning, while Kareem insisted it was later in the day. Their accounts of how they discovered Anthony's unresponsive body varied, each telling a slightly different version of the story. The detectives pressed on, their questions becoming more pointed, their tone more assertive. They inquired about the numerous injuries found on Anthony's body, injuries that spoke of prolonged abuse rather than a singular accident. Heather's calm began to waver. She stumbled over her words, her previously rehearsed narrative unraveling. Kareem's bravado faded, replaced by visible agitation. As the hours wore on, the facade of innocence they had attempted to maintain crumbled. Heather admitted that she had been overwhelmed, that caring for her children had become too much for her to handle. Kareem confessed to disciplining Anthony, though he downplayed the severity of his actions. The detectives listened, their expressions impassive, as the horrifying truth began to emerge. The interrogation revealed a twisted dynamic between Heather and Kareem, a relationship marred by control, manipulation, and a shared culpability in the abuse that led to Anthony's death. Heather, in her desperation to please Kareem, had allowed the abuse to continue, turning a blind eye to the suffering of her own child. Kareem, asserting his dominance, had inflicted unimaginable pain upon Anthony, viewing him as an inconvenience rather than a human being. In the end, the detectives had their answers. The initial facade of concerned caregivers had been stripped away, revealing the monsters beneath. Heather Barron and Kareem Leva were arrested, charged with the torture and murder of Anthony Avalos, a tragic testament to the depths of human cruelty. In the tragic case of Anthony Avalos, The role of the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, has come under intense scrutiny. Despite numerous reports and clear signs of abuse, the system designed to protect vulnerable children failed to intervene effectively, leading to Anthony's untimely death. Between 2013 and 2016, DCFS received at least 13 reports concerning Anthony's welfare. These reports, filed by teachers, counselors, relatives, and law enforcement, detailed allegations ranging from physical abuse to neglect. However, despite the severity and frequency of these reports, DCFS's interventions were inadequate. Investigations were often cursory, with caseworkers failing to conduct thorough interviews or follow up on critical information. In some instances, children were not interviewed separately from their parents, a standard procedure meant to ensure unbiased accounts. Additionally, there was a lack of collaboration with law enforcement, leading to missed opportunities to safeguard Anthony. A 2019 California state audit highlighted systemic issues within DCFS, noting failures to complete timely and accurate safety and risk assessments during investigations. The audit emphasized that these shortcomings were not isolated incidents but indicative of broader systemic problems. In response to these failures, Los Angeles County reached a $32 million settlement with Anthony's family. This settlement acknowledged the department's shortcomings and the need for substantial reforms. DCFS has since implemented changes, including revised policies, enhanced training for social workers, and efforts to reduce caseloads to ensure more thorough investigations. The tragic death of Anthony Avalos underscores the critical importance of a responsive and effective child welfare system. It serves as a somber reminder of the dire consequences when systemic failures allow vulnerable children to remain in harm's way. In the aftermath of Anthony Avalos's tragic death, law enforcement intensified their investigation, meticulously piecing together the evidence that would ultimately lead to the arrests of his mother, Heather Barron, and her boyfriend, Kareem Leva. The gravity of the evidence against them painted a harrowing picture of prolonged abuse and neglect. The gathering storm of evidence. As detectives delved deeper into the case, they uncovered a series of alarming findings. Anthony's body bore unmistakable signs of sustained abuse, bruises, burns, and indications of malnutrition. These injuries were not the result of a singular incident, but rather a culmination of prolonged mistreatment. Further compounding the evidence were the testimonies from Anthony's siblings. They recounted instances of severe punishment and neglect, providing first-hand accounts that corroborated the physical evidence. These narratives were instrumental in building a comprehensive case against Barron and Leva. Inconsistencies and revelations. During initial interviews, both Barron and Leva attempted to deflect blame, offering explanations that were inconsistent with the evidence at hand. Their narratives failed to account for the severity and extent of Anthony's injuries. As investigators pressed further, the discrepancies in their stories became more pronounced. A pivotal moment occurred when Leva, during questioning, made statements that raised suspicions. His comments not only contradicted earlier claims, but also hinted at a deeper involvement in the abuse. This admission provided investigators with a crucial breakthrough. Prosecutors meticulously assembled the case, drawing upon medical reports, witness testimonies, and the defendant's own statements. The comprehensive nature of the evidence left little room for doubt regarding the culpability of Barron and Leva. The autopsy report was particularly damning. It detailed the extent of Anthony's injuries, highlighting patterns consistent with prolonged abuse. This medical evidence, combined with the testimonies from Anthony's siblings and other witnesses, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The arrests. With a robust case in place, authorities moved forward with the arrests. Both Barron and Leva were taken into custody, facing charges that included first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture. The severity of the charges underscored the heinous nature of their alleged actions. The arrests marked a significant step in the pursuit of justice for Anthony. They also served as a somber reminder of the systemic failures that allowed such abuse to persist unchecked. The path to the arrests of Heather Barron and Kareem Leva was marked by diligent investigative work and the courageous testimonies of those who spoke out against the abuse. While the legal proceedings would continue, the arrest represented a crucial juncture in holding those responsible for Anthony Avalos's tragic death accountable. In the solemn confines of the Los Angeles County courtroom, the trial of Heather Barron and Kareem Leva commenced, casting a stark light on the harrowing circumstances surrounding the death of 10-year-old Anthony Avalos. The prosecution presented a compelling case, meticulously detailing the alleged abuse and torture that led to the young boy's tragic demise. Central to the prosecution's case were the testimonies of Anthony's half-siblings, who provided first-hand accounts of the environment within their Lancaster, California home. One sibling recounted instances where they were forced to kneel on uncooked rice, a form of punishment that left lasting physical and emotional scars. Another described being denied food and water, enduring prolonged periods of hunger and thirst. These testimonies painted a grim picture of a household where cruelty was routine. The defense, in response, sought to challenge the credibility of these accounts, suggesting that the children's statements were inconsistent and influenced by external factors. They argued that the injuries sustained by Anthony could have been the result of accidents or self-inflicted harm, rather than deliberate abuse. However, the prosecution countered by highlighting the consistency in the siblings' testimonies and the corroborating evidence from medical examinations, which indicated patterns of injury consistent with prolonged abuse. Medical experts took the stand to provide further insight into the extent of Anthony's injuries. A forensic pathologist testified that the boy had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head, leading to a fatal brain injury. Additionally, there were signs of malnutrition and dehydration, suggesting a prolonged period of neglect. The expert concluded that the combination of these factors was indicative of sustained physical abuse. Throughout the trial, the courtroom atmosphere was tense, with observers often moved to tears by the graphic descriptions of the abuse and the emotional testimonies of the witnesses. The prosecution presented evidence of prior reports made to Child Protective Services, highlighting a systemic failure to intervene despite clear warning signs. This aspect of the case underscored the broader issues within the child welfare system in Los Angeles County. As the trial progressed, the defense attempted to portray Heather Barron as a victim of domestic abuse herself, suggesting that she was under the control of Kareem Leva and lacked the agency to protect her children. They presented witnesses who testified to observing Leva's domineering behavior and Barron's apparent fear of him. However, the prosecution rebutted this narrative by presenting evidence of Barron's active participation in the abuse, including testimonies from the children describing instances where she directly inflicted harm upon them. In their closing arguments, the prosecution emphasized the severity and deliberateness of the actions taken by both defendants. They argued that the evidence demonstrated a clear pattern of torture and abuse, leading to Anthony's death. The defense, conversely, urged the court to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt, pointing to the lack of direct eyewitnesses to the fatal incident and the potential for alternative explanations for the injuries sustained. Ultimately, the court found both Heather Barron and Kareem Leva guilty of first-degree murder and torture, sentencing them to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow by those who had followed the case, serving as a somber reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by children like Anthony Avalos and the critical importance of vigilance within the child welfare system. The trial of Heather Barron and Kareem Leva not only brought justice for Anthony Avalos, but also highlighted systemic issues within Child Protective Services. It underscored the necessity for reforms to prevent such tragedies in the future and to ensure that reports of abuse are taken seriously and acted upon promptly. In the aftermath of the trial, there have been calls for increased training for social workers, better interagency communication, and more robust oversight mechanisms to ensure that children at risk are identified and protected in a timely manner. The case of Anthony Avalos serves as a tragic example of the dire consequences that can result from systemic failures and the collective responsibility to safeguard the most vulnerable members of society. On March 7, 2023, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Sam Oda delivered his verdict. Barron and Leva were found guilty of first-degree murder and torture, with the special circumstance of murder involving the infliction of torture deemed true. Additionally, they were convicted on 2 counts of child abuse concerning Anthony's half-siblings, identified in court as Destiny O. and Raphael O. The courtroom was thick with emotion as the verdict was read. Family members and advocates, who had long awaited justice for Anthony, felt a complex mix of relief and sorrow. Emily Carranza, a cousin of the late Gabriel Fernandez, a child who suffered a similar fate in Palmdale, remarked, "The verdict is the correct one, and life in jail with no parole is the right sentence that they can give." The sentencing, held on April 25, 2023, was equally poignant. Judge Oda sentenced both Barron and Leva to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before the sentencing, the court heard heart-wrenching victim impact statements from Anthony's relatives. Maria Barron, Anthony's aunt, expressed her anguish, stating, "It just broke me, but I want to move on. Close this chapter and start the healing process and become a better person and do what I can to help other kids just like Anthony." The public's reaction to the verdict was one of collective mourning and a call for systemic change. Advocates emphasized the need for reform within the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, highlighting the repeated failures that allowed Anthony's abuse to continue unchecked. Prosecutor John Hatami and Anthony's family voiced their desire for comprehensive changes to prevent such tragedies in the future. Despite the life sentences handed down, some family members felt the punishment was insufficient. They had hoped for the death penalty, a possibility that was removed following policy changes by District Attorney George Gaskin. This decision left many feeling that full justice had not been served. In the aftermath of the trial, the community grappled with profound questions. Was justice truly served? Did the punishment fit the crime? While the legal proceedings concluded with convictions and sentences, the deeper issues of systemic failure and the need for reform remained pressing concerns. The case of Anthony Avalos stands as a somber reminder of the vulnerabilities within our child protection systems. It underscores the imperative for vigilance, accountability, and comprehensive reform to ensure that no child endures the suffering that Anthony did. As the community reflects on the verdict, the hope is that Anthony's story will serve as a catalyst for meaningful change, honoring his memory through actions that protect and cherish the most vulnerable among us. Anthony Avalos is gone. But what has his case changed? Did the system learn? Or is history waiting to repeat itself? The brutal truth about child protection failures in America. In the wake of Anthony Avalos' tragic death in 2018, Los Angeles County, California, faced a profound reckoning. The 10-year-old's passing was not an isolated incident but part of a distressing pattern of child protection failures within the United States. Following Anthony's death, the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, reached a $32 million settlement with his family, acknowledging the grave missteps that led to this tragedy. This substantial settlement underscored the severity of the department's failures and the pressing need for systemic reform. Despite this legal resolution, questions lingered. Had the system truly learned from its mistakes? Were meaningful changes implemented to prevent such tragedies in the future? Unfortunately, evidence suggests that systemic issues persist. Reports indicate that child welfare systems across the United States often treat poverty as a basis for neglect charges, leading to unwarranted family separations. Moreover, a comprehensive analysis by Human Rights Watch revealed that many U.S. state laws fail to meet international child rights standards, leaving children vulnerable to various forms of harm. This national crisis highlights the urgent need for comprehensive reforms to protect the most vulnerable members of society. In Los Angeles County, the deaths of children like Anthony Avalos, Gabriel Fernandez, and Noah Quattro have become emblematic of the systemic failures within child protective services. These cases have prompted public outcry and demands for accountability, yet challenges remain in implementing effective reforms. The driving ideology of many child welfare agencies emphasizes keeping children with their families or reunifying them after brief foster care placements. While family preservation is a noble goal, it must be balanced with the paramount need to ensure children's safety. The tragic outcomes in cases like Anthony's demonstrate the devastating consequences when this balance is not achieved. In the aftermath of Anthony Avalos' death, Los Angeles County officials pledged to address the systemic issues within DCFS. However, the persistence of similar tragedies indicates that these efforts have been insufficient. The system's failure to protect vulnerable children remains a pressing concern, not only in California but across the United States. As we reflect on Anthony's story, it becomes evident that his case was not an anomaly but a symptom of broader systemic failures. The question remains: has anything truly changed? The answer, regrettably, is that while some steps have been taken, significant challenges persist. The child protection system in America continues to grapple with deep-rooted issues that require comprehensive and sustained reform. Anthony Avalos' tragic death served as a catalyst for scrutiny and calls for change within child protective services. Yet, years later, the system remains fraught with challenges, and the risk of history repeating itself looms large. It is imperative that policymakers, child welfare agencies, and communities work collaboratively to implement meaningful reforms to safeguard vulnerable children and prevent future tragedies.